Coach Heather here, talking to you again about sleep. So let's dive right into it. There are two factors that determine our sleep and our awake time. One of them we spoke about already, the circadian rhythm. The other one has to do with sleep pressure. Sleep pressure is something that has to do with a chemical that circulates in our brain, especially called adenosine. And adenosine's job, or I guess let's start with it. So it's something that from the moment we wake up in the morning, we start accumulating more and more of this. It's totally normal, and it just happens from when we wake up all the way, every minute and every hour, all day long. We keep accumulating more and more of this throughout the course of the day. And it really peaks somewhere between 12 and 16 hours later once we wake up. So adenosine's job is, part of it is to build up this feeling of sleepiness. So when I say it peaks, it means that about 12 to 16 hours after you wake up is when you start to feel tired. And its job is to a couple things. One is to start to lower, think of it as like knobs. It sort of turns the knob down that makes you feel like you want to stay awake, and turns the knob up that makes you feel like you want to go to sleep. So that's kind of what adenosine's job is. So now I want to talk to you about caffeine, really. So caffeine, the way that interacts with the adenosine is that adenosine, there are these receptors or these welcome sites in our brain, and that is what adenosine latches onto. And that's what makes all of that feeling like you want to start getting ready for bed. That's where that happens. Caffeine is, what that does is it kind of acts as a masking agent and comes in and sort of intercepts that chemical and latches onto those receptors and builds basically this wall between your brain and that chemical that makes you feel like you want to go to sleep. So what also happens is that when caffeine comes in and does that, your body still keeps creating adenosine. It doesn't just stop. That's not what caffeine does. Your body still keeps accumulating and almost like pulling together all this adenosine that is what it would normally be doing. But now you are feeling like alert and awake because it's not actually latching onto those things that give your brain the signal that it's time for you to go to sleep. So what happens is that once that wears off, once your caffeine wears off, all of that pooling of all that adenosine now sort of surges and rushes in, and now you're feeling the tiredness that you would have felt, as well as all of this other adenosine, and it kind of drops on you, and that gives you sort of that caffeine like drop. So you know how you'll have a cup of coffee and it'll make you feel awake and alert, and a few hours later you'll start to come down from that. And then if you have more caffeine, you start to feel awake and alert again, and if you don't, you just sort of stay in this little plunge. So that's the danger of the cycle of caffeine and why we need it so badly all the time. The thing that is also dangerous that we don't always recognize is that caffeine is a stimulant. It's a drug. It's not a food. It's not like a substitute, and it's a drug. So it has, like a lot of other drugs, it has this efficacy rate and it has this half-life. And basically your half-life of caffeine is about approximately 6 hours. So what that means is that if you have a cup of coffee at noon, that means that half of that caffeine is still circulating in your brain tissue at 6 p.m. And then it has a quarter life of 12 hours. So at midnight, you still have a quarter of the amount of caffeine in your brain that you had from that cup of coffee that you had at noon. So essentially, the advice is that you stop drinking coffee, or not coffee necessarily, but you stop doing caffeine, whether it's pre-workout or coffee or whatever it might be, 14 hours before you go to bed, which is kind of crazy. Which I was just talking to Kat about this, and we were like, we don't even know if we're awake for 14 hours a day. But essentially that means that if, say, you go to bed at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, that means that you should stop drinking caffeine somewhere around 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, which is terrifying to me. Now, that doesn't even include things that other things have caffeine in them, which includes things like decaf coffee, where decaf is not just 100% no caffeine. It actually, most decaf coffees have 15 to 30% of what a normal cup of coffee has in a cup of decaf. So if you're having a few cups of that around dinner time, it's basically like you're having a cup of coffee. So just remember that things like decaf coffees, but then also other things like dark chocolate, ice cream, some teas, pain medications, weight loss medications, all these things have caffeine in them also. So even little bits of all of those things add up to more than we actually think that that's going to be. So our quality, we want to talk about our quality, which we've talked about recently also. The quality of our sleep is affected by sleep. So a lot of people will say, Cole Sager is one of these guys that he can have a cup of coffee at 9 o'clock at night and fall right asleep. He is fine with the falling asleep part. What we don't know though is if his quality of sleep is suffering because of the caffeine that's in his system, particularly so late at night. One interesting thing, before we dive too far into that, is the effects of caffeine on your system. So in the 80s, NASA did an interesting study on spiders, and they exposed spiders to a couple different drugs. So they noticed that, if you can see this, that spiders, when they spun their webs, this is what their normal webs looked like without any exposure to any sort of drug. So when they expose them to things like LSD and speed, this is how, I can't see, this is how the pattern of their webs changed. When they then expose them to things like marijuana, I don't want to ruin the big surprise, this is the one for marijuana, which actually isn't that bad. So if you do something, marijuana's a good way to go. But what's interesting is the effect that caffeine had on spiders, and the kind of web that they spun after being exposed to caffeine is now down in the bottom corner. Like, it's just completely unfunctional, makes no sense. Their brains are just kind of not, I don't know what if they even have brains, but I mean, of course they have a brain, but is severely affected by the exposure to caffeine. So the last thing I want to wreck for you, because now that we can't have a cup of coffee after 7 o'clock in the morning, is the idea that alcohol is I keep getting these messages from my brother. The idea that alcohol actually affects our quality of sleep a ton also. So think about the fact that when, one thing that's interesting, I was just talking to Maya about this because she's a college student and drinks heavily. I'm just kidding. The idea that a lot of times when people go out and have a bender one night, the next morning they wake up and a lot of times they're like, God, I had crazy dreams last night. Like, first of all, we know that caffeine alcohol is not it doesn't help us sleep better. It's a sedative. So it gives us the impression that we're sleeping, but we're actually not getting very good sleep at all. So what happens with that is that when we drink a lot at night, our liver and our kidneys go through this process where they work really hard to break down and get rid of the alcohol that's in our system. While that's happening, we can't really get almost any REM sleep at all. So we're not able to tap into that really sort of partially restorative side of sleep. So what happens is that when it finally does clear through the alcohol and then it does start to settle back into its normal stages, then it takes whatever REM sleep we would be getting those last few hours of sleep, but it also tries to get back and rebound on the REM sleep that we missed out on because we were over functioning in other ways to try to compensate for the amount of alcohol in our system. So then what happens is we have this huge surge of all this crazy dreamlike state because it's all happening at one point when it's actually meant to be spread out over the course of more hours of sleep. So there you have it. That's way more than I'm supposed to be talking in these talks, but I'm so fired up by all this sleep talk, and the caffeine thing is really, and what I'm trying to do now is I will get up in the morning and I'll have my cup of coffee, and then I'll start my day either taking the 7:30 class or something, and then that's it for me. And I'll do some tea, and I'll try to do decaffeinated, like herbal teas that have no caffeine in them or something. But try to curb your caffeine intake way before. We used to say noon would be a good time to stop. It's actually way earlier than that. And see how it affects you if you do it for 2 to 4 weeks, and see if you're feeling more rested in the morning when you wake up. All right, guys, go get some sleep, stop drinking coffee, and don't drink alcohol, and you'll be as miserable as I am.